All right. I think we've given people enough time to get situated. I'm very excited to be here today, and I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us for this noon hour panel on the US election that is fast approaching on Tuesday, November 3rd. My name is Dr. Martin Gaal, and I'll be your moderator for today's panel, along with Cade Brossart, the president of the Political Studies Student Association. Awesome, Cade. Before we begin, I would just like to acknowledge that I live and work on Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis, and that we pay our respect to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. I would also like to start with the usual preemptive request for your patience. This will be our third Zoom webinar event, and knock on wood, they've all gone relatively well, but it is possible and perhaps even likely that we may have the odd technical glitch. So if so, please bear with us. Now, during election years, it is a tradition for the Department of Political Studies at the University of Saskatchewan to bring together a panel of experts who specialize in various political fields, to provide their informed opinions on the positions of the parties involved and what's at stake in the election. And this US election is a big election. The past 4 years have been tumultuous. Domestically, there's Black Lives Matter, deep red-blue divisions, efforts to repeal the Affordable Health Care Act, vastly increased ICE enforcement, SCOTUS nominations, or Supreme Court of the United States nominations. It has been a very full 4 years. Bridging the domestic and the international, we in Canada have an increased awareness of what's been happening in the US. We also see the evidence of foreign interference in elections, and particularly via social media and through digital bots. Internationally, there's been the withdrawal of the US engagement and a destabilization of international political and economic order. This has created degrees of instability and has put everybody in the world a bit on edge. In Canada, we've experienced a whiplash in our relationship with the US, from tariffs to the events with Huawei to the Canadian-US-Mexican free trade agreement. So it seems there's a rawness to the political contestation at the moment, both in the US and with those countries that deal with the US. But I'll stop there because I'll be letting our experts dig into these issues. So tonight we are fortunate to have three such experts. We have Dr. Sean Speer, who's an assistant professor in public policy at the Monk School at the University of Toronto. Beyond his expertise in public policy, Dr. Speer has a personal connection to the Republican Party in the United States and will be speaking to that. So we've therefore asked Dr. Speer to record his answer to the following question. What is at stake if Joe Biden is elected in the 2020 presidential election? Dr. Amanda Kokoski von Koppenfeld is a reader in migration and politics at the University of Kent's Brussels School of International Studies, my alma mater. Beyond her extensive work in migration, Dr. KVK has been very active in Democrats abroad. We have therefore asked Dr. Kokoski von Koppenfeld to record her answer to the following question. What is at stake if Donald Trump is reelected in the 2020 presidential election? And finally, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Paul Quirk, the fill-in chair in US politics and representation at the University of British Columbia. Dr. Quirk has been asked to provide commentary on the two videos. So I'll ask for your patience here for a moment. We're going to transition to the first video that was recorded by Dr. Speer.
Hello, my name is Sean Speer. I'm an assistant professor at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto and a former economic advisor to the Right Honorable Stephen Harper. I've been asked to speak to you today about the upcoming U.S. presidential election and how Republicans and conservatives are thinking about the race. I record this video from my home in New York City. I live in a district that is overwhelmingly Democrat. But I've had an opportunity through my own experiences in policy and politics to get to know conservatives and Republicans in the United States. And so that has given me some window and insight into how the party and the broader intellectual and ideological movement is thinking about the race. It's an extraordinary time, of course, and Donald Trump is an extraordinary Republican standard bearer. It's easy to forget that he won the party nomination in 2016 with less than 50% of the support up until virtually the end of the primary. In fact, the research shows that he was amongst the weakest primary candidates in recent memory. And that's in large part because some of you will recall that the Republican field was large in the presidential cycle that year. I think it started with about 16 candidates, ranging from Rand Paul to Jeb Bush to Marco Rubio to Ted Cruz and so on. And in that crowded field, Mr. Trump was able to win pivotal early states with, in some cases, 30 or 35% of the popular vote. And so his relationship to the Republican Party and the broader conservative movement has always been complicated. And of course, that's only increased in his 4 years as president. And so how Republicans and conservatives think about this race, I think, is in large part a reflection of this complicated relationship that Mr. Trump has had with the party and the broader movement. And I think it's probably useful to distinguish between party faithful, party supporters, and institutional Republicans, including members of Congress in the House and the Senate. Mr. Trump has had durable support from Republican Party faithful. Even today, as I record this video, his approval rating is somewhere around 40 or 42% within the general population, but markedly higher with Republicans. In fact, due in part, I think, to the phenomenon of negative polarization, Mr. Trump's political support amongst Republican voters has remained remarkably durable during his chaotic and tumultuous presidency. That has created real difficulties, I think, for elected Republicans, many of whom didn't endorse Mr. Trump when he first ran for president, and I think have general misgivings with his style, tone, and comportment. It's been fascinating to watch for the past 4 years how elected Republicans have tried to engage or position themselves vis-a-vis the White House. There's not been a tendency to directly criticize the president, even at times when it was certainly justified. And I think that in part reflects the fact that for a lot of members, Republican members of Congress, there's a concern that Mr. Trump's popularity with voters in their districts or states is stronger, more salient than their own support levels. And so we've witnessed this dance, even amongst the most independent members of the Senate. I think, for instance, of Ben Sasse, a Republican senator from Nebraska, who early on sought to distinguish himself from the president and was probably amongst the most outspoken Republicans. But when push came to shove and he was facing a primary challenge in his reelection campaign, he too ultimately came to have more muted position vis-a-vis the president and his transgressions. So that's a long way of saying, I think, Republican supporters will continue to support this president through the upcoming election, and will no doubt be disappointed if in the end he's ultimately defeated. I think there will be at least private sigh of relief on the part of a lot of elected Republicans who have become exhausted with having to try to defend the Trump presidency and its transgressive nature. I just want to make a couple of other quick points before I leave you. The first is about how Republicans and conservatives might think about a possible Biden administration. People will know that Mr. Biden himself has a long track record in the Congress and personal relationships with many longstanding Republicans. And so, I think, again, at the elected level, there may be disagreements on policy and concerns about some of the directions of a Biden administration. The truth is, at a personal, relational level, there's a stronger connection between Joe Biden than there is with Donald Trump. And so it'll be fascinating to observe the extent to which a Biden administration is able to work with Republicans, particularly in the Senate, on areas of mutual interest. On the party faithful side, on the other hand, I anticipate that we'll see a kind of similar pushback to the Biden administration that we saw in the early years of the Obama administration, and of course, the type of resistance we've witnessed vis-a-vis the Trump administration. I think for better or for worse, we are stuck here in a cycle of ongoing partisanship, and hopefully a Biden administration is able to make some progress in this regard, but I think there's reason to be skeptical. The more interesting question, it seems to me, is on what the future of Republican politics and conservative ideas is in the aftermath of a Trump presidency. For better or for worse, President Trump has disrupted conventional Republican politics and conservative thinking on a wide range of issues, including trade, immigration, globalization, the welfare state, industrial policy, and so forth. And I think it's unlikely that the party will ratchet back to its conventional pre-Trump positions after the 2020 presidential election. I think it's much more likely that the presidency of Donald Trump will produce a paradigm shift in conservative thinking and Republican politics, and will witness different voices competing to advance a new and different kind of conservatism. We're witnessing that presently, even if it's not necessarily showing itself, expressing itself in the public domain. I think there is a dynamic intra-conservative movement debate happening, rather, and I think the Trump presidency has been the catalyst for that, and the outcome of which, well, is still to be seen. I think it will result in a new and different kind of Republican Party and a new and different kind of conservative politics. And while that intra-debate can be messy and unedifying at times, it's also dynamic, I think, and interesting, and will ultimately become a major part of the political story in the United States. If you think about the 2024 election cycle, I think, for instance, you'll have different candidates emerge, ones that represent a return to the old Republican agenda that can be broadly described as neoliberal, and then I think you'll have other Republicans who pursue a different path that is less transgressive than the Trump presidency, but seeks to bring expression to some of the issues that it unearthed around, as I say, trade and globalization and the role of government in the economy. So, it seems likely that Mr. Trump presidency may come to an end in the upcoming election. I do think it is likely that his influence over Republican politics and conservative idea will be longer lasting, and result in a change in how Republicans speak and think about a whole wide range of issues. And I think there's reasons to be disappointed about the state of American politics, and how Republicans elected Republicans have dealt with the worst excesses of the Trump administration. I'm ultimately optimistic that this dynamic intra-debate that I mentioned will produce a new and a better Republican Party, a more constructive Republican Party, and ultimately one that can bring expression to the interests, concerns, and aspirations of the voters who elected Donald Trump, but in a way that speaks more directly to these issues with practical solutions, as opposed to the empty populism that we've endured for the past 4 years. So with that, thanks for the opportunity to contribute to the discussion and for the opportunity to share with you my thoughts and insights about the upcoming presidential election and how Republicans and conservatives are thinking about its potential outcomes.
Perfect. Can everybody hear me? Excellent. Thank you very much. I also didn't want a technical glitch there as we're going between. So we're now going to switch to our second video by Dr. Klukowski von Koppenfeld.
Hi, I'm Amanda Klukowski von Koppenfels. I'm Reader in Migration and Politics at the University of Kent at Brussels, the Brussels School of International Studies. I'm American, I'm a Democrat, and that's why I'm speaking you to here today. I've been asked to talk a little bit about what I think, from a Democratic perspective, a Trump presidency in a second term would look like. And so with the Coney Barrett hearings over and voting on her confirmation starting, the Supreme Court is the first point that I'm going to have to mention. In a second term of a Trump presidency, we would see healthcare overturned. Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, passed in 2010. That is something that the Republicans have consistently been trying to undermine over the last 10 years, particularly under this administration. President Trump has said he hopes that he would see this law rendered unconstitutional in the Supreme Court. And so in a second term of a Trump presidency, if it is overturned, then we will not see a legal remedy to putting that back in place in any way. The second thing that will be under threat is a woman's right to choose. Roe v. Wade, of course. That's something that a Trump Supreme Court with Coney Barrett confirmed, and again, with Trump in the presidency, would likely be overturned. The third thing that is at risk in a Trump Supreme Court would be marriage equality, the right for same-sex partners to be legally married. Again, particularly under a pandemic, that is something that is where healthcare in the United States is linked to employment. Having the right to marry a partner of one's choice makes a big difference. If one is laid off, but if you're married to your partner, you can remain on health insurance for your partner if you're married. And so that is something that, like healthcare, undermining those rights in a pandemic, from my perspective, is a questionable choice, but that's something that we can expect to see. The second thing, or perhaps even the first thing, of course, is COVID. There is at the moment no end in sight. Cases are going up. President Trump, having caught the virus himself, having recovered, as many people do, of course, has said, don't let it dominate you. The families of 220,000 Americans who have died of the virus, I think, would disagree with that statement. And that's something that a Trump presidency would continue to have no plan for COVID-19. He would continue to allow states to handle it. States as Vermont, Massachusetts, California have been doing an excellent job. Many other states have not. And that's something that without federal guidance, you will continue to see that worsen in the United States under a second term. The third point would be foreign policy. And that's something that already in the past almost 4 years since Trump has taken office, we've seen a loss of stature in the United States, largely in Europe, less so in Asia, but certainly in Europe. And there we see that Europe no longer sees a partner in the United States. They are waiting on a lot of things until they find out what happens on November 3rd. Who will they be dealing with in the White House? China is increasingly gaining stature in the world as the United States is losing it. And that's something that I think we can see continue in a second Trump term. The U.S., there's a global passport index which ranks the power of passports. And the United States has traditionally always been, with a couple of other countries, in first place. It has recently fallen to 21st place. And the way they count this is how many countries do you have visa-free access to? And Europe and many other countries are blocking access for U.S. citizens who want to come as tourists, and just like many other countries. So the United States is now 21st. Canada, by the way, is tied for 4th position. So that's certainly something that plays a role as well. And that's, of course, as a direct result of this administration's poor handling of the COVID situation. Another point that I think is very key to mention is the economic situation. What we're seeing right now is what they call a K-shaped recovery, and that's something that will continue, where the wealthy get wealthier. Think Jeff Bezos. I sure do wish I had bought shares in Amazon, but that shares, President Trump likes to point to the stock market and how well it is doing, but actually only 10% of American households own 87% of stocks. So that means that when we see the stock market going up, that's benefiting 10% of American households. Sure, there could be some trickle-down economics going on, but for the people who are unemployed and laid off and don't have a job, they don't have any companies who are passing any of those benefits on to them. And so that's something that when we see this K-shaped recovery of the wealthy getting wealthier, but the poor remaining poor or getting poorer. And so that's something that we will see continue as well. Migration and refugees, my own particular area of interest, that's something where we have seen over the past almost 4 years a very strong cutback in migration to the United States. Not just the undocumented population being targeted by ICE raids, but also legal formal streams of migration to the United States being limited. The refugee cap for resettled refugees, the United States, along with Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, one of the leading countries in the world in terms of taking in resettled refugees, has been cut to 15,000 refugees. Typically, it's been around 80,000, 90,000. So that's an enormous cut. And so that's something that we will see continue over the next 4 years. USCIS, the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, has furloughed many of its staff. So even if you don't actually have a formal limitation in certain visa numbers, you're just going to have difficulties in processing those because they don't have the people right now. And so that's something that, again, we'll see continue in a second Trump term. Really, when they say make America great again, they actually mean make America white again. And they're talking about racism and nationalism. And that's something that really is important. Along similar lines, the Black Lives Matter movement. And that's something that Trump has responded to by calling for law and order. There has been no support for communities of color who are struggling with deeply entrenched racism. And that's something that he refuses to accept, and we will continue to see that. He has barred federal agencies from doing training on implicit bias, on racism. He calls it he says that it divides people and calls it un-American, and that is something that, again, we will see continue. And so that's something that really, I think, a second Trump term is something where this continues to be damaging to the United States, to its international role, to its domestic situation, whether it's on an economic front, whether it's talking about immigration, whether it is about the Supreme Court and three very key rights, the right to choose, a right to health care, and a right to form a family, which is a fundamental human right. All of these will be under further attack in a second Trump administration. I hope I've given you enough to discuss. I think that should keep you busy. Do enjoy your discussion, and all the best.
Excellent. So at this point, we're going to turn the floor over to Dr. Polkwerk to get his insight on the two videos.
Thank you very much, Martin. Excuse me, and thank you to Sean and Amanda for very interesting presentations. I have about three topics that I would like to talk about. The first is to, excuse me, make note and comment a little bit on the kind of obvious asymmetry between the attitudes or dispositions of the speakers to the respective candidates, and so Amanda is an avowed Democrat, and she really made the case for the importance, in many respects, to her of Biden winning over a range of issues. And Sean, who was appointed to present a Republican perspective, has credentials for that job, that is, as a former advisor to conservative government. but doesn't really make a case for the Republican side. And you could argue that his main concern is to suggest hope for the Republican Party to recover from the Trump period after a likely Trump defeat. And I'm thinking that some people may be tuning in and saying, well, what we have here is a bunch of professors, doing their usual routine of saying why people should favor Democrats and oppose Republicans, or favor liberals and or oppose Republicans. And on that point, I want to kind of make a bit of a biographical observation. In teaching American politics and in my writing about it over the course of a career, it has been my practice normally to try to make it not evident which political party I vote for or support. And in general, I had been able to do that. But that approach kind of requires the expectation that you have two political parties or two ideological groups, and in the period that you're commenting on, they are both more or less equally grounded in reality and in evidence-based judgments and decisions, and they are both more or less faithful to the rules of the political system and the norms and constitutional norms and so forth. And many commentators with whose typical disposition is nonpartisan do not think that that's the case in our current era. It is most dramatically true about President Trump. And I'd say that it is very widely agreed among people with any semblance of nonpartisanship over a period of career, but also many people who have been consistent Republican partisans. That broad of a group kind of concurs that President Trump has been unfit for office and is a danger to the country and has produced a great deal of harm. So what I want to say is that this isn't just a bunch of liberal professors doing what they always do. The difference between the presentations that Amanda and Sean gave with respect to their orientations to the parties, I think reflects that Sean is similar to what virtually all thoughtful, independent, conservative thinkers in this period are thinking. On the stakes in the election, there is one really important point that I think was omitted, and that is that I think there are very big stakes about the preservation and health of democracy and the rule of law in the United States. I would have expected Amanda to say quite a bit about that. So this has to do with ultimately the protection and guarantee of free and fair elections and non-political administration of justice in the United States. And there are a couple of aspects of that, of the threat to that. The first is Republican efforts at voter suppression, which have been, which are widely described. There is a general Republican temptation to this in our era, and that is because demographic trends appear to be severely adverse to the Republican Party. There are a number of aspects of that. One of them is the increased number of immigrants, especially from Mexico and to some extent other Latin American countries and other places. But what's actually more clear and more dramatic is that in the United States in this era, young people are far more liberal, especially on social issues, and far more prone to support Democratic politicians than old people are. And those old people are going to be disappearing. So Republicans have some temptation to try to block voting from some parts of the political system. And they have been, there have been a number of controversies about efforts in a number of states, primarily to suppress or stop, reduce the number of support of voters in black areas, or blacks being primarily Democratic in their orientation. Now, I should point out that some of the disputes about this are legitimate disputes about how elections should be run. That is, it's not simply, it's not written in stone, given, by God, that voting should be as easy as possible. That is exactly what many people think. Small d Democrats tend to think that. But there are reasonable people who think, well, if somebody won't bother to get a decent ID card, that proves who they are, then maybe they shouldn't vote either. There are disputes that are about that. And in the current era, in the current election, there are some disputes about exactly which adjustments should be made to take account of the COVID crisis and the difficulty of people voting in person. So some kind of last minute improvising has occurred in a number of states about the election system, extending early voting and extending counting of late votes and the like, of mail-in votes and the like. And those have been, there are some legitimate controversies about that. At the same time, some of the tactics of Republicans have been, I think, impossible to defend on any sort of honest grounds concerned with free and fair elections. One of the ones that have gotten a lot of attention is that the Republican governor of Texas has specified that boxes for dropping off the ballot would be limited to a single box per county. And that includes Harris County, in which Houston is part. And so you're talking about a population of, 4 million people or something like that with one drop box. Now, there are other ways to vote, and it looks like Harris County is going to have enormous turnout, so this may not matter particularly, but there are certainly efforts underway on the part of Republicans to suppress votes that are to some degree a threat. Now, an interesting question is, if Republicans were to win this election, given their temptation and concern about demographics, how far would Republicans go in the future? And how far would courts, which might be populated disproportionately by Republican and especially Trump-appointed judges, how far would courts allow them to go? And I don't actually know the answer to that. I think one could be hopeful that most of that a large majority of the Supreme Court would block anything that was really nakedly partisan and obstructive without any justification. But that's only part of the problem about democracy. The more immediate problem, I think, is that Trump has made numerous efforts to distort the administration of justice for his personal and political benefit. The most obvious and kind of dramatic example of that is that in recent campaign appearances, he has routinely been calling for the arrest and punishment of Joe Biden, his election opponent, on absolutely no credible grounds whatsoever. Now, furthermore, the Justice Department during his era, especially under Attorney General William Barr, has done a great deal that has protected Trump's political associates and friends, and has distorting the administration of justice within the Justice Department. Quite a number of high-level Justice Department officials have resigned because of that. And one of the things that is noticeable is that as time goes on, Trump gets better at controlling the agencies. And there, I think, is a significant risk of real loss of fairness. The worst case scenario is in the 2022 election, if Trump is president, do they arrest a bunch of Democratic candidates for the Congress? So that's the absolute worst case scenario about this. So that is a very large stake. And I'll just make one quick comment about Sean's remarks about the future of the Republican Party. Actually, two quick comments. One is to point out, I think he hints at this, but I think I want to put this on the record, that there are legitimate policy concerns that conservatives have about the direction that a Biden administration would take. Obviously, people who are pro-life have a strong reason to be concerned about that, but the whole range of issues about levels of government spending, amounts of regulation, the costs of a healthcare reform, support for police, the policies about immigration. There are all kinds of issues where Republicans have reason, based on legitimate policy differences, to be concerned about a Trump presidency. But then the question that Sean ended on is, to what extent, what would be the future of the Republican Party, and how will it reform or be transformed in the event that Trump loses? William Kristol, who is a very important former Republican, was a leading Republican commentator, still a leading conservative commentator, but a strong opponent of Trump, one of the leaders of anti-Trump movement, has pointed out he is very pessimistic about the future of the Republican Party. And that's because, as he put it, the Trump era has proved that angry white populism works politically. There are media that support it. There are a lot of people who respond to it. And I think it's very apparent that many Republican candidates will be appealing to that base in the future. Now, I think a likely future for the Republican Party is that it will not be competitive at the national level. That is, if it goes in this direction, that is for presidential elections or for controlling the majority of the House or the Senate. But it would be internally divided between angry white populist panderers or demagogues and people who are seeking a return to a more normal, basically economic liberalism based Republican Party. And this party would cause a lot of disruption in government, but not be very likely to control it much at the national level. So those are my thoughts, and looking forward to some questions.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So now we get to the interesting part, which is opening the floor to you to pose your questions. Everybody's interesting, but I like to see this kind of interplay with our students and supporters with our experts.
Me too.
So for those of you who haven't participated before, in a webinar function, we have a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So you have your mouse at the bottom, you'll see the Q&A. The Q&A questions that you post will only be seen by the panelists, and I will forward them on to Dr. Quirk.
Are you going to read them to me, Martin? I forget what you said about this. You're going to read them to me, or?
Yes, sir. I will read them out.
Good.
That way, if we get a lot of questions, I can condense them together.
Yeah, very good.
So while we're waiting for you to start typing those questions, and we do already have one in here, so I will get to that in a moment, I'm going to hand over quickly to my co-moderator, Cade Brossart, who will introduce himself and pose the first two questions to Dr. Quirk that were provided by students in advance.
Thanks, Dr. Gaal, and thank you, Dr. Quirk, for your analysis. My name's Cade. Like Dr. Gaal said, I'm a fourth-year political studies student here at the U of S, and I'm serving this year as the president of the Political Studies Students Association. So we canvassed some of our members and students at the U of S, and we got some questions put together, and we're going to start with the most pressing one that was on a lot of people's minds, and that's that polls indicate that Biden right now has a lead over Trump. Should Democrats trust these polls, or should they be mindful about what happened in 2016 when the polls predicted a Clinton victory?
Yes, very good question. The most reliable way to figure out what the polls are showing is to look at two different websites. One is called 538, and that's named after the number of electoral votes in the presidential and electoral college, and the other is an election forecasting page that is maintained by some truly outstanding political scientists at The Economist magazine. And both of them make the most elaborate conceivable, and actually almost more than conceivably elaborate analysis of polls, figuring out from the history of polling how much error is really likely to occur. At this point, these two forecasts differ, but not by a huge amount in their estimates of the probabilities. 538 has a Biden victory as an 89% probability, and The Economist has that same outcome as a 95% probability. While saying this, I'll point out that there is some way, some degree in which it is sort of impossible to really tell what the error might be. When people read polls, they're kind of accustomed to the idea, well, there's just 3% error margin. That's actually the margin for one poll, which might have a sample of 1,000 or something like this. But these aggregators are using, literally by this point, probably low number of hundreds of polls in state levels and national levels. So that kind of error isn't a factor at all in these polls. The difficulty is you can't really be sure who's going to turn out. They ask questions about, to get evidence from that, and they do their best at making that estimate, but they can't be sure. But my feeling is that the way they weigh these chances is as reasonable as you can get. So my own estimate is in the same range. That's somewhere between 88 or 89 and 95% likelihood of a Biden win.
Wonderful. We'll do one more question that was submitted by a student before, and then I think we'll turn it over to Dr. Gaal because we're getting lots coming from the audience, so that's great. So this one focuses more on the Republican side of things. And he asked, if Trump loses this election, he would still roughly have 2 months in office before Biden would be sworn in, right? So what could we expect to see from the Trump administration during these 2 months before Biden's inauguration?
That's an excellent question. The thing that is probably the central matter that is relevant for this is that Trump is widely known to have considerable legal vulnerability for after he leaves office. That is, there are a considerable number of criminal and civil matters on which he is potentially, he may be prosecuted or he may be sued. One thing that one would look forward one thing that I think one could confidently expect is that he would probably resign at some point in favor of Mike Pence, with the expectation that Mike Pence, then as president, would pardon him. But he could only be pardoned for federal crimes. He would still have vulnerability to state crimes, and there's not much he could do about that as president. Another thing that people have said is that everybody in the White House expects that there would be a raft of other pardons that Trump would give before resigning to people for whom he would like to do favors. People with criminal problems for whom he would like to do favors with the expectation that they might be able to do favors for him. As for substantive policy, there isn't normally anything really dramatic that a president can do in that last period of time. If it's a matter of the president signing some order, there are things that the president can just sign an order for. Those can be reversed immediately by the President Biden, and there's not a lot gained by doing that. And then Congress is certainly not going to pass any legislation on his part. So I think I think a whole lot of noise and complaining, and what's really much more likely to be occupying a fair amount of this period is an effort on his part to dispute the outcome of the election and to claim that there was fraud in some places, or to try to interfere with the voting, with the counting of the ballots in some places. So there'd be fairly likely for there to be dramatics about that.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I'm going to have to try to triage some of our questions here because we only have 10 minutes left.
I'll try to be briefer.
No problem. The answers have been fabulous. So normally I'll be condensing these together, but we have a specific shout out from a former student, Chelsea Lerner, who was also a student of mine at one point and took your American government class in 2017. And so she's asked that, do you think the Democrats put too much faith in the Supreme Court, and that after the passing of Justice Ginsburg, it was portrayed like the world was ending? What direction do you think the new Supreme Court will take?
Well, the court. First, it's nice to hear from you again. But as to the first part of the question, Chelsea's question, I think it's important to understand that Democrats and liberals did indeed kind of rely on the court to do a lot of policy innovating. The most controversial decision that we're still debating about is in fact Roe versus Wade. And if you set aside your opinion about whether abortion should be freely available and just consider what the constitutional basis what there was for declaring free access to abortion as a national policy, as opposed to the prior state where it was up to state governments. The constitutional basis for that was really quite weak. So Democrats have benefited from courts being very activist and willing to impose their policy positions. And now, the Republicans now have a clear majority of the court and are doing some of the same things. The special circumstance, however, of this period is that the court is now 6-3 Republican appointees and conservative appointees, and this is after a period of I forget the exact number of years, but 6 or 7 elections in which the Republicans have actually won the popular vote only 2 times. And then arguably, because of reinterpreting the confirmation process, Republicans have kind of stolen a couple of appointments from the Democrats during the Obama and Trump administration. So there is a real prospect that Democrats will decide that this is intolerable, this imbalance in the court, and pass legislation to increase the size of the court to permit Democratic appointments. They could increase it to 11 or to 13. If they increased it to 13, they would appoint 4 members of the court, and they'd end up having a 7 to 6 majority. That is a real possibility.
Perfect. Thank you very much. We have several comments in here and questions about your comment on white populism and angry white populists. And a couple other questions tied into the electorate's response to the presidency at the moment. So do you think that this rise of populism and this catering to white angry populists is leading to it's undermining faith in the electoral system in the US?
Well, I don't know whether that policy attitude in itself is what has undermined faith in the electoral system. I would say that Donald Trump's attacks on the operation of the electoral system are overwhelmingly the principal cause of doubt about it, along with actual Republican efforts to suppress votes, which are easy to document. I think you could have an angry white populism that was fine with elections, but for the time being, to the extent that it's associated with Trump, there is that connection with doubts about elections. This trend toward populism based on conservatism about social issues and immigration is not limited to the United States. I just saw an observation that the Conservative Party of Australia is now kind of largely influenced by that same view. So it's a similar transformation, a party that had been representative of business and upper income people, or middle class and upper income people and business largely, now has a very different base. And how that party works out is hard to say, because there are real conflicts of interest between those different factions within the party.
Maybe just a quick follow-up, more in terms of writ large. Do you think there is a reduced faith in the American electorate at the broadest level? The loss of faith in the system?
Well, we have polls. I was sort of kind of taking that for granted, and it's good for you to raise this. There is a very recent poll asking people whether, if the opposing candidate, the one they don't prefer, wins, whether they will believe it was the result of a free and fair election or not. And the level of that faith or trust is extremely low right now by historic standards. And I think the reasons are basically Trump has promoted false claims about the frequency of voter fraud. And then on the other hand, Republicans have demonstrated willingness to take extreme steps to suppress votes or interfere with ballot counting.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. And this is a few people have framed various versions of, but they're really asking about the future of the Republican Party post-election. And you've mentioned kind of this division between more neoliberal or classical liberal, that you have the social conservatives, and you also have this populist movement. Will it be more united in the future after a period of maybe evisceration, or is this going to really plague the party?
That's a very interesting question. I would say that some period of losing national elections is likely to impose some discipline in the party. That is, give advantages to the voices within the party for what Sean called, a constructive, conservative alternative to democratic policies. There is there's sort of an analogy here, which was that after in the 1960s and the 1970s, as a kind of influenced by both the civil rights movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement, there was a very powerful, strongly left orientation that was influential within the Democratic Party. And it appeared to cause the Democrats quite a bit of grief and some losses in elections during that period. And as a consequence of that, I think Democrats who were concerned about winning elections kind of learned that they needed to discipline the message of the party. And since then, the party has been much more disciplined. So I would expect that over a period of time, that kind of change would occur within the Republican Party too. Now, what's really important to keep in mind, however, is that in a Republican Party of the sort that I envisioned, with a lot of angry white populists and divided from a economic liberalism faction, in such a party, many members of Congress will be winning their elections easily and will be more or less satisfied with the way things are going. A party can be a minority party for a long time.
That's perfect. Thank you very much. I'm just going to impose on everybody for 1 or 2 more minutes since we've extended past our time. And I just would like to offer my sincere thank you to Dr. Speer and Dr. Klukowski von Koppenfeld for sharing their insight on the upcoming US election. I'd especially like to thank Dr. Quirk for being here today and answering our questions and helping us to understand what is at stake in this election. There truly are few countries in the world whose domestic politics have such profound effect on the world. Unfortunately, we didn't get a chance to get into many of the international relations questions, which are kind of more my field, but the US is one of those countries, especially for Canada, whom we share a border with, an undefended border, the longest undefended border. I'd also like to thank my co-moderator, Kay Brossart, and the Alumni Association for making this possible in terms of our Zoom and helping us coordinate. And I would ask you to please stay tuned for our next event, which is our second Global Cafe this term on November 18th with Miss Tricia Gaddis, Deputy Director of Policy and Strategic Partnerships at the Canadian Secret Intelligence Service. You'll be getting information about that soon. I would just like to thank all of our attendees, and I hope you are surviving our online and remote teaching environment. On the plus side, it's given me a golden opportunity to bring brilliant people in like Dr. Quirk that we might not be able to normally hear from. So thank you very much, and take care.
Thank you.